Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hello, and welcome to Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. Today we are going to explore the outsized and remarkable role of the Erie Canal in American religious history. The Erie Canal is an outstanding example of a human artifact creating and facilitating new religious movements. Within 25 years of its opening, the Erie Canal cultivated extraordinary experimental spiritual groups, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Adventists, Spiritualism, a revived Apocalypticism, utopian communities such as the Oneida Community, with the Amana Colony and Shakers passing through as well, and the emotion-laden revivals of the Second Great Awakening. The canal also engendered the religiously infused social movements of abolition, women's suffrage, and temperance. And because of its key location and function as the link between East and West, the repercussions of canal-formed spiritual experiments rippled across the continent with westward expansion, creating unique currents of religion in the United States into the present day. So we have with us two scholars, S.B. Rodriguez Plate, who is a professor of religious studies at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, and author of many books, including A History of Religion in 5.5 Objects, Bringing the Spiritual to Its Senses, and Religion Film, Cinema and the Recreation of the World. SB investigates the ways people connect with physical objects through sense perception. The things we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch are what give us our spiritual dimension. Matthew Smith is visiting professor of history and the regional director of public programming at Miami University, Hamilton, Ohio Regional Campus. Matthew's research interests include American religious history, Appalachia, the Ohio Valley, and transatlantic immigration. Dr. Smith is the author of The Spires Still Point to Heaven, Cincinnati's Religious Landscape, 1788 through 1873. SB and Matthew, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us. Great to
Pleasure.
be here.
Okay, so I'll just put this out to both of you, as will all questions will be for both. But how did you first become interested in this story? So let's, I guess, start with SB.
Yeah, I grew up in California, and I got a position out here at Hamilton College, many years later. I'm in central New York. The Erie Canal corridor is just, about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. And it was one of those things that I learned in grammar school. There was the Erie Canal and a mule named Sal, and, sing the songs and things like that. And then I got out, and I had no idea what that meant, what the Erie Canal was. And then I got out here and lived here. I kept passing these signs saying, entering the Erie Canalway, the Erie Canal corridor. And like, oh wow, this is a real thing. It still exists. And, it just got me interested. And as I sort of settled in upstate New York here, central New York, my kids were growing up and the area, and got more interested in the history of the space, and begin to think, oh wow, this is kind of amazing, and begin to see all these what seemed like coincidences, that so much happened along here with as we'll talk about through the session here, but with new religious movements, as a religious studies scholar, of course, these things appealed to me right away. But also real interest in how religion operates as materially based. Most of my research is sort of suggesting that we are changed by our senses and by our infrastructure, by our physical technologies that we build and make. And so this really resonated with all these interests of mine. So it's really fun to sort of come to this area and realize what's going on here.
Yeah, what a place for a religious studies scholar just south of the Erie Canal. I think our listeners will have obviously heard of the Erie Canal and American religion, but had not put them together. Matthew, what got you interested in this?
Well, what I love about doing, podcasts like this one is you get sort of opportunity to talk about esoteric connections such as religion and canals, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily put together, but actually, the more you look at it, the more it makes sense. And so I found it interesting as well. SB was talking about, connections and coincidences, but we're both speaking from Hamilton, I guess Hamilton, New York, and Hamilton, Ohio, and of course Hamilton was the essentially the founder of American capitalism. So I think what draws me to this topic in particular, coming from Southwest Ohio, you mentioned at the top of the podcast, my work is American history, but I also do a lot of public programming. So I'm always sort of attuned to anniversaries, commemorations. We're coming out, of course, now the 250th anniversary of the United States, and it's also just past the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal's opening, which is really, in many ways, the symbolic beginnings of the American Revolution. And also, 200 years ago, it was the first turning of the spade of the Miami and Erie Canal, which is a kind of radiation and extension of the canal system that connected Southwest Ohio ultimately to the Great Lakes, and via the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. So all these connections. I do a lot of work with local historical societies as well as Miami University. I'm now a member of the Middletown Historical Society, so a major American industrial city historically, which was founded with the canals, and that wouldn't have been around had it not been for DeWitt Clinton 200 years ago, commissioning the Erie Canal. But in terms of the religious history as well, there is a fascinating, connection there that I'm sure we're going to dive into more deeply during this podcast.
Great. Okay, thank you both. Very compelling, compelling stories of how you got here. Matthew, perhaps you can paint the American religious landscape for our listeners at the time the Erie Canal was built, and then a little bit about the canal itself. Not too much, but just a little bit there to give us some background.
Sure, and as you mentioned, I think most of our viewers will be aware, at least broadly aware, of the Erie Canal. But it came in the midst of what historians would later refer to as the Second Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening of American religion. This is also what's known as a revival. So, as the great American revivalist Charles Grandison Finney, who was actually from Rochester, New York, in the heart of the Erie Canal zone, said that the idea of a revival implies a declension. In other words, it's the idea of an awakening. It's almost like a sort of periodic pattern that you find in American religious life of rise and fall, declension, and awakening. And this goes back, of course, many of your viewers and listeners as well may have heard of the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, which was the colonial Great Awakening, which in many ways was the first kind of event in American cultural history, which really connected all 13 colonies, what would later become the United States. In many ways, sort of laid the connections, which would later be the foundation of the American Revolution 250 years ago. So 200 years ago, you have this coincidence of the beginnings, really, of the American Industrial Revolution coinciding with this second Great Awakening of American religion. And so, in terms of the religious landscape, of course, by today's standards, you would have to say, was America as diverse religiously as it is today? Probably not. But I think you're beginning to look at the foundations of the diversity that we're familiar with it in modern America, emerging especially in this very sort of narrow corridor, probably from around Buffalo to Troy, New York, which was referred to by Grandison Finney. He didn't actually invent the term, but he popularized it, the burnt over district. And this is the idea that there is this district. And of course, New York at that time, we're talking about upstate New York, not New York City, was still really the American frontier in the early 19th century. And so a lot of the religious activity that was happening was taking place outside of the normal confines of church meeting houses or regular Sunday worship. These were itinerant preachers. These were almost camp meeting revivals, if you like. But it was this beginning of this culture of this kind of mass popular revivalism. Finney, in particular, Charles Grandison Finney, who was a really interesting guy. He was 6'3" tall, had piercing blue eyes, was the son of a New England farmer who had moved to New York, had practiced law, converted to Christianity, and became really one of the most successful revivalists, not just in America, but anywhere in the world at that time. Um, and he really kind of put in place the playbook, if you like, for the modern religious revivals. He wrote this book published in 1835, Lectures on the Revivals of Religion, which was actually a sort of almost like a starter pack or a how-to book of how to organize a religious revival. And up until that time, revivals had been seen as kind of, wonders of the will of God. These were, kind of supernatural acts or interpreted as supernatural dispensations. And Finney said these are actually, these are the product of man. This is like, the Erie Canal. This is something which is engineered, so you can bring people to God through preaching, but also through the application of certain measures. There's almost a science of revivalism which starts to evolve under the leadership of Finney and others in the 19th century. So this is kind of the also, on top of that, I would say New York in particular was really a hotbed of utopian communities. You mentioned the Shakers, the beginnings of the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, the Millerites, which would go on to become one of the foundations of the Seventh-day Adventists, all come from upstate New York at this time. So there is this tremendous cultural ferment which is going on in this one particular corner of the United States. Very much connected to the Erie Canal, I would argue.
Okay, well said. Thank you. SB, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just I mean, just one quick thing, extending really what Matthew already said, but I think a lot of it sort of understood that a lot of the theological notions of the Europeans who came and colonized this part of the world were under a theology that was much more Calvinistic, much more, we call it deterministic, right? It's as Matthew said, sort of this was God's will that these things would happen. Part of the big shift that happened, and I think it's hard not to see it's bound up with the rise of capitalism. It's bound up with the rise of free enterprise and things like that, and all these things that were made possible through the Erie Canal. But part of what Finney did was to sort of switch people's ideas theologically towards a more free will thing. That this is a long-standing kind of Christian debate. Free will versus determinism goes back to medieval philosophers and the likes there. But different people arguing back and forth. But I think there's pretty good evidence that a lot of what came to the United States was that, or came to what became the United States from Europe, was imported a kind of more of a deterministic kind of Calvinist way of thinking. And part of what, big emphasis of what Finney did was begin to write in more of a free, push people towards free will and the idea that people had their own choices. They could do things in the world. They had action in the world. And this led its way, and maybe we'll talk about this here in a little bit, but led it directly connected to the kind of apocalypticism that occurred, very much, again, tied up with capitalism and free enterprise along the way. So I think that would just be the only thing I'd add
Okay.
there, just or emphasize really what Matthew's already saying.
Well, that's a great segue because why don't we talk about apocalypticism and the Erie Canal? SB, why don't you take a shot at that?
Yeah, so going with that, I think a lot of what is happening here in upstate New York at the time, again, as Matthew said, this is very much, this is what people called the wilderness, right? I mean, of course, this is where the Haudenosaunee had been living for hundreds and hundreds of years and thousands of years, really, tracing back. But the Five Nation Confederacy that was here and instilled, for hundreds of years before any of the white Europeans showed up here is really important. So the element that it was called wilderness. So there's that, that it has all kinds of ideological baggage just to call this area the wilderness, as many of the people did. But of course, it's also bound up with ideas of manifest destiny, this idea that God gave this land to us, right? Us, Christian Europeans along the way. That was really a key element to all this. But coupled with that idea of this kind of free will, this kind of theology that Finney especially promoted, the idea was that this was a new Eden, perhaps a new, a chance to start over, a new garden, going back to the beginnings, and but different than I think really striking to me is the difference with kind of apocalyptic thinking today. I was just watching one of the 28 days later movies the other day on the plane, and this just brought up all these. I've written a lot on film and apocalyptic film, and the idea of the end of the world is, oh, it's this terrible thing that's happening. But back 200 years ago, part of what's happening is people thought Jesus is coming again and we better get our lives together.
Hmm.
Really different idea than the apocalyptic ideas of today. They knew Jesus was coming, so you better look good. You better get your stuff together, right, and act right. And so people wanted to improve themselves. They wanted to get better. They wanted to, do the will of God along the way. But again, it was kind of a free will. It was our choice to do it. And, through that, we created these utopian communities. Through that, we created a number of different movements. From the Latter Day Saints, the name itself, Latter Day Saints, they understood themselves to be in the latter days of existence, that Jesus was going to come again. Advent, the word Advent means, of course, the coming of, refers to the coming of Jesus, and so Adventism, which and just to note, the LDS Church and the Adventists are two of the forces in the world today, right, in the 21st century, that are still actually growing quite rapidly, right? We keep hearing these stories of the end of religion and the secularization going everywhere, but actually groups like the LDS Church and sort of Mormonism, and not just the LDS part of Mormonism. Mormonism kind of encapsulates much more than that. And the Adventists, these are growing churches around the world. People are joining these churches in many ways. So this idea of apocalypse was really important, I think, at the time, and coupled again with free will, it meant, hey, let's do things. Let's make our world a better place. Let's live in community like God meant us to. And we can talk about this here in a few minutes, but the rise of the women's rights movements, women's suffrage, abolition of slavery, and then temperance, right? These are really the three big social movements that are going on at the time. And they're all religiously based social movements. And I think they're all very much tied to these ideas that we need to improve our world. We need to get better at things.
Okay, great. So the apocalypse then was more of a positive thing. Jesus is coming. Ooh, I'm going to improve. We're going to improve our community instead of like a really dark view of destruction and things like that. Um, okay, helpful. Matthew, why don't you tell us some details about um, the Erie Canal's influence on Adventism, specifically Seventh-day Adventists? I know that many came out of Adventism. That's the one that's existing today in large numbers. But just tell us about how the Erie Canal interacted with this
Um,
religious movement.
I'll take a crack just in general. I have to say I'm not really an expert on Adventism, but
Okay.
the f- one of the founders of what would later become the movement of Adventism was this guy called William Miller, who was really a kind of very characteristic figure of the Second Great Awakening. He was a basically a kind of farmer preacher, which was something that was very common in the 19th century. And he develops this charismatic following. It is maybe a little bit more like what we would think of today as apocalypticism in the generally understood sense. Although I think SB, maybe you can sort of confirm the idea of apocalypticism. If you look at the word apocalypse, actually means kind of an unveiling. It's not necessarily, like 28 days or some sort of zombie apocalypse. But Miller believed again that the world was going to literally come to an end, and his followers then in upstate New York would give away their worldly belongings. And there was actually what they called the Great Disappointment. They actually called it the Disappointment, where his followers, I actually believe some of them gathered on top of a hill, believe it or not, having given away all their real estate and sort of disencumbered themselves, because Miller had been looking at scripture and had I forget the date, but he had identified a specific date in the 1840s when he believed the world was going to come to an end, and of course that didn't happen. um and so people were actually disappointed, if you can understand being disappointed by the world's failure to end, because this was part of this promise. And then Miller then goes back to the drawing board and says, "Well, I made a miscalculation." And what I find fascinating about that is many of his followers at that point, just called it quits. But some of them, maintained that belief that Miller was a true prophet, and went back, and there was what they called then a second great disappointment. So having having failed to predict the end of the world once, he failed a second time. um, but Miller's movement, believe it or not, did not dissipate, but then became part of this background, which would later merge and become the Seventh Day Adventist Church, which actually also was also largely led by there's a lot of female leadership at the Seventh Day Adventist Church as well, which is kind of interesting. New York is also, of course, where you have the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And I think more broadly, I think this is kind of an example of what I would call, in a way, the kind of democratization of American Christianity. You have these figures who are like William Miller, farmer preachers. They're not, educated at elite seminaries like Andover or Yale. They're, predicting the end of the world. That might be seen as a sort of extreme example, but there really is kind of a continuity, almost, I would say, between what you might think of as the sort of apocalyptic and also utopian movements in the Second Great Awakening, and also mainstream revivalism. We should also recognize that churches that we might think of as very mainline today, such as the Methodists and the Baptists, were also growing tremendously in terms of church adherence and numbers as a direct result of the Second Great Awakening. And the Erie Canal was not just moving goods and services; it was also moving people and ideas. So I think that's where that ties in. I don't know, SB, if you've done more research on William Miller and the Millerites. They're certainly a very interesting group. Miller himself, I think, he was also publishing newspapers, so he's part of this transformation of print culture in the 19th century. The flow of, it's a time of information technology as well as commercial technology. So I think this is all part of what might seem like a very kind of eccentric movement, but is also connected directly to capitalism and modernity.
Yeah.
Yeah, SB, what do you have to add as far as, especially how the
Yeah.
canal helped with the Millerites and
Yeah, one kind of a thing to add there was, of course, as Matthew began to push at, part of why Miller became so, Miller was actually along the Champlain Canal, right, connected, that going up to Lake Champlain. So it was part of this whole, it wasn't just, we talk about it as kind of this 363-mile long, thing, but it was, all these offshoots that went down. There's the Chenango Canal, there's the Champlain Canal, inspired all the canals in Ohio eventually. So it was this really large network of things. It's really, I think it's just, again, hard for us in the contemporary age to understand how important this was. It's, equivalent to, what the interstate highway system became in the mid 20th century, and similar to what the internet, became into the 20th and 21st century. It was just it connected so many things. So many things just changed. Social life changed so radically through it. So William Miller's up on the Champlain Canal, and part of he's doing newspapers, he's doing these little tracts and all kinds of publishing media that are going out. He worked with Joshua Himes was the name of the printer, I think, who worked with him, and literally they count like millions and millions of tracts and papers and things were being distributed throughout the Erie Canalway, and that's how Miller sort of gains. It's not just like he was he was a farmer, preacher, and just kind of shouting from his rooftop. I mean, he's media savvy, right? He's getting these things in people's places, and it's all traveling through the canalway, right? All this printed material is traveling through the canalway at the time, and passing through on the boats, and other things, and passing through town. So he gains part of his currency, as Charles Finney, similar kind of thing. The revivals, the reason 10,000 people or more would show up in Utica, New York in the 1820s was because they printed advertisements, right? And they had it all ready they were ready for him to come and show up. So it's the media aspect of it is really, I think, important for the canal as well.
Okay.
And yeah, and just one sort of very different idea, as Matthew said, the women were important. Of course, someone like Ellen White, who, really just sort of as one example among many, who sort of showed after the Great Disappointment, shows up. There's a big meeting in Albany in 1845 that really spurs the whole Adventist movement. And Ellen White and a number of others really are the kind of founders and shapers of what become known as, Seventh-day Adventism. And of course, they travel out towards, and they found the great sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan. That the idea was, they promoted vegetarianism. All these wonderful connections. Graham, where we get the idea of the graham cracker, sort of comes out of that tradition as well. It was meant to be this really healthy snack, and they were vegetarian because, again, Jesus is coming soon. We need to purify ourselves and get our lives right. So live right, and part of what the Adventists understood by that meant to be vegetarians. And this was, and again, this is in a time sort of before, the Europeans had come here, and the wildlife. I mean, again, it's just hard for us, I think, to understand from even a biological perspective, the counts of the wildlife in this area, and the abilities to eat meat, right? To just gorge ourselves on goose and duck and deer and everything along the way. People were just filling themselves up with meats in ways that were just not available because Europe, the Europeans had been there for so long, and there just wasn't as much left. This was this land of abundance. And so this kind of excess eating was part of, I think, too, and interestingly kind of embedded in some of the Adventists' ideas towards vegetarianism. Like, we need some restraint here. We can't just, gluttony is one of the cardinal sins. We need to become vegetarian, was their answer to these things. So, all these kind of fascinating social mores and ideas are kind of changing, and practices are, part of this. It's about the landscape, it's about the wilderness, it's about the animals that were available. But of course, it's also about theology. It's also about print, and just this magical kind of, almost for us, for those of us kind of doing history. It's just like, wow, just all these things just feel like they're interconnected to each other.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so
Okay.
that's part of it.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. Let's move to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and talk about how the Erie Canal played a role in the rise of that church and its spread. So I don't know who wants to take a first shot at that, Matthew or SB.
Sure. I mean, I'll, kind of continue on a couple of the similar kinds of ideas. So Joseph Smith's families from New England, they end up in Palmyra, a little town, Manchester, Palmyra area, just outside of Rochester. Farming community. Again, this is the kind of wilderness, the Europeans are cutting through Haudenosaunee land and understanding themselves to be, civilizing the place and these kinds of things. So they end up there, and every we're far from the kind of authorities of the Matthew had mentioned, the kind of farmer preachers, that sort of crop up, because there's no authorities yet. It's still such a new place that, there's no, there's the Pope's reach, and all the Protestant denominations are based in Europe. They really don't have much jurisdiction here in central New York. And so people were just kind of popping up with their own kind of twists on what they knew. So Joseph Smith comes out to this area, and he talks about, he's got this great line in some of his, autobiographical kind of sketches, talking about, he says there was a great excitement on the subject of religion. And he says priest contended against priest, and they're sort of arguing against each other, and there's the Methodists, and you got the Presbyterians, and you got the Episcopalians and the Baptists, and everybody's got their own ideas. And it's really out of that. And it's, again, it's the canalway. He begins to sort of work really at the same time that the canal is being brought to. I mean, it cuts right through Palmyra. And so by 1825, when the canal is finished, Smith is getting his own kind of ideas going, listening to everybody. But then in 1829, 1830, he this whole idea of, he finds these golden plates, begins to translate them, according to the stories, and prints up the Book of Mormon. But to print, they wanted 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. But to do that, you needed a printing press, and a big printing press. The only way really to get that to Palmyra was to get it from New York City on a boat, and it had to come by boat, right? So there's no Book of Mormon without a canal boat, without a canal. It sort of traces itself back. You can't it's a, it was a couple 1,000-pound press. You can't carry that on horseback all the way to Palmyra, New York. You needed a better system. And this is before, of course, the railways came in and things like that as well. So there's that level. But Mormonism really begins, the Latter-day Saint really begins there. Of course, he runs into Joseph Smith, gains some followers. There's many, they print 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon, even though there's probably only a couple thousand people who live in the town. So he had big expectations of what this would do. Of course, as the story goes, we know it was not, always accepted too well, and they left town fairly quickly after that. They got on canal boats and they went towards Ohio. They went to Kirtland, Ohio, and eventually went west. And then the second person, of course, key person, is Brigham Young, who similarly born in New England, lived and worked on the canals. He painted canal boats. This was part of Brigham Young's job, was to work on the canalway. And heard about Joseph Smith, heard about this, and eventually went west and caught up with them on their journey west. But again, it was because of this kind of social, economic, religious network that the canal provided that really made the Latter-day Saints, as a church, actually made it possible for that to actually happen.
That's super fascinating, that the Erie Canal was so vital to so many parts of that story. Matthew, anything to add before we move on to, perhaps some of the utopian, movements and, progressive ideas?
Um, Not a lot to add, but just in terms of this kind of ferment of the Second Great Awakening, I don't think there's anyone better to look at than Joseph Smith in terms of his personal, if you want to call it, journey. I know that's a sort of overused word, but his spiritual journey, before the his claims of revelation. He was really kind of very typical of a lot of young men in upstate New York at that time. His family, I think, were originally from Vermont, which was also very typical. But he was attending all kinds of different revival meetings, different churches. And so it was almost like a sort of smorgasbord of religion. also wedded to a lot of folk religious beliefs and sort of practices, scrivening. So there is this sort of wonderful eccentricity, but at the same time, a lot of these eccentric movements are also very keyed into what is happening in America at the time. I mean, Joseph Smith would eventually run for president of the United States of America. So these are not, necessarily as countercultural in the sense of fleeing from the mainstream of the culture. They're also using the tools of the mainstream culture to propagate their messages, whether that be through print culture, through politics, through the Mormons even sort of organize themselves into private militia companies, things like that. So they were very much part of almost mirroring the development of American society at that time through their community practices.
Yeah, great, thank you. Let's touch briefly upon utopian movements. I think our listeners will have heard of the Oneida community and just the topic the of utopian communities. What were some of the communities that interacted with the Erie Canal? Matthew, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, probably the oldest when we're talking about the utopian communities would have been the Shakers, because it was actually founded by a woman from just outside Manchester, England, woman who went by the name of Mother Anley. Anley was a member of the Quaker Church, um, and the Shakers were really a sort of offshoot of Quakers, Shakers. Both of these terms, actually, it's the sort of slightly pejorative connotation that they originally had. I believe the Shakers' official name was the Church of Believers in Christ's Second Coming. So again, this kind of millenarian end times, sort of a utopian community. But Mother Anley was very interesting. Of course, the revelation of the Shakers was, they practiced celibacy. They were very much millenarian. They believed the end times were coming. And they were communist, not communist in a Marxian sense, but believers in communal living. And this was also typical of many of these utopian communities. So Anne Lee and some of her followers from England actually settled in, I think, the town, maybe pronouncing it wrong, Watervliet, which was a Dutch-founded town in upstate New York. Actually arrived there just on the eve of the American Revolution. I think they actually settled there and established the first American Shaker commune in, I think it was 1774. I want to say just before, anyway, the Battle of Lexington Concord. Um, and so, this movement, again, many of our viewers and listeners will have a sense of the Shakers. They're the utopian community living apart from the world. But again, very much involved in commerce, very much involved in capitalism in their own way. And the Second Great Awakening as well connected different parts of the United States. So, in actually one of the first manifestations of the Second Great Awakening was actually in the Ohio Valley, Kentucky and Ohio. The Shakers had a revelation that the gospel would be opened in the West, and they sent a party of Shaker missionaries who actually traveled by foot. This was before the Erie Canal, from upstate New York to Ohio and Kentucky, and this was actually the foundation in the early 1800s of the Shaker communities. There were about about four or five of them in Kentucky, Ohio. There was also one that was short-lived in Indiana. But by the time, of course, you have the Erie Canal, again, this is also, a highway for the commercial life of the Shakers. They're very much involved in horticulture. They're one of the first people to commercially market paper seed packets that are sold as market garden supplies. And they're having their own revivals as well, because of course, if you're celibate, if you don't believe in natural procreation, the only way you can actually sustain your membership is through either adoption or revival, people coming to the church. Now, of course, they were also apocalyptic in the sense that they believed they were living in the end time. So that was kind of an interesting kind of parallel. So, but we can compare the Shakers with some of the other movements that were in upstate New York, which were maybe a little bit later. I know the Amana community or the Ebenezer community, sometimes known as. These were German immigrants. They were part of this transatlantic sort of pietist movement from Europe at the time. You have the Fourier communities, which were sort of kind of socialist utopias, but also had a kind of uh, Christian background. And then, of course, you have the Oneida communities, which are interesting because John Humphrey Noyes, who was one of or who was the main founder of the Oneida community, was actually a convert to evangelical Christianity under Finney during his Great Revival in 1830. But then Noyes himself was actually kicked out of the Presbyterian Church for taking the idea of human perfection to too great an extent, I think, even for the revivalists of the time. So you have this idea of, again, this idea of the perfection of the individual, which is kind of tied to Finney's idea of free will, and free will being a sort of way for humans to realize God's will, but also tied to the perfection of society, and that becomes again utopian, both in the sense of idealistic, but also in terms of kind of incubating these societies that were once kind of separatist, but also very much engaged with the world in their own particular ways.
Okay, great, helpful. SB, anything to add to the Erie Canal and utopian movements before we move to the last question for both of you?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to say that, again, all these are moving up and down the canal. They're, part of their livelihood, right? Once you sort of live in community apart from regular society, you have to have some sort of economic basis to keep going. And, as Matthew talked about the seeds with the Shakers and, different elements of agriculture, it was important for these things to be, again, transported. And this was sort of the infrastructure. The Oneida community, people oftentimes know this through Oneida silverware, although increasingly less and less, but major silverware company of the 20th century began from the Oneida community. The Oneida community supported itself by different metal work. So they made bear traps and beaver traps and things like this. And they sold them, and they would be, again, kind of distributed up and down the canalway. So the canalway also was providing this sort of economic basis for these communities to survive.
Well,
All these communities need, some sort of economic ability to keep going.
right. Okay. Wonderful. So, SB and Matthew, as we conclude, uh, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from this particular subject matter, the Erie Canal and American religious history, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative? SB, why don't we start with you, and then Matthew, you can have the last word.
Yeah, I think just I want to, make sure we sort of bring in at least two of the key social movements, and that is sort of women's rights movements. The Seneca Falls Convention, as Matthew mentioned earlier, in 1848, again, is happening along the Canalway. People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, the really three prominent women who are pushing the women's right movement. All of them are born and live along the canalway. They're educated along the canalway. They are, coming up with radical new interpretations of scripture, for instance, rethinking history in all kinds of ways, and making great fights for women's rights. I mean, not just the right to vote, but for women to be educated in many different ways. A really important thing that it's hard. You can't really distinguish that from the religious religious and social, those things come together. And of course, that's all tied in with the abolition of slavery and the, equality for Black people in the United States. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are moving up and down the canalway. Frederick Douglass settles in Rochester in the 1840s, I think somewhere around there, begins his sort of media work out of there. Harriet Tubman is working along the canalway. The Erie Canalway becomes part of the Underground Railroad. And lesser known people like Jermaine in my area here in Utica, Syracuse area, Jermaine Logun founds a bunch of, he's one of the directors of the, conductors of the Underground Railroad, is also founding AME churches in the area. Austin Stewart over in Rochester is, has escaped from being enslaved and finds economic life in Rochester and teaches Sunday school and promotes kind of a utopian community. They go off to Canada for some time, and it sort of fails fails in various ways. He returns to Rochester. So all these social movements are going along at the same time, these socially progressive movements at the time, all very much religiously inspired, all very much possible because of the Erie Canalway. So really, it's just kind of an important element to all of this. It's not just all theology and preaching. It's very much it's a social gospel that's emerging at the time. That's, I think, just really critical to understand.
Great. Thank you for making that connection. That's super important. Absolutely. Matthew.
So I just want to end off with a couple of quotes, just a pair of quotes, which I think is kind of interesting because if you think about American democracy, I mean, we tend to sort of think of American democracy in crisis, perhaps in the current moment. But we also tend to go back to the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and, the Constitution, obviously. I think of the Northwest Territory Ordinance as well, if you're from Ohio. But I would argue that actually American democracy has concrete foundations. And so, if you think of the technology of the Erie Canal, the ideas that come through that technology are as important as, some of the founding documents that we tend to refer back to. But I also think that, the Erie Canal sort of teaches us a lot today about the ambivalent nature of technology. That the one hand, it creates democracy, but at the other time, it's sort of that technology itself implies, technology is never a neutral system. It sort of swallows everything up in its wake. And so I have two contrasting quotations here. The first one, actually, this one is from a Quaker minister writing in the 18 teens. This is the time of the proposal of the Erie Canal. This is a great quotation, one of my favorite. Elias Hicks, the Quaker minister, wrote, "If the Lord had intended there should be internal waterways, he would have placed them there." So it's a sort of, this idea of almost hubris, that you're sort of going against the will of God by engineering the landscape literally. This is, to sort of paraphrase the late historian Daniel Walker, how what God had wrought, what has God wrought, what is man wrought. But then at the same time, I'm just looking this up from I found this quote it's actually in Perry Miller's Life of the Mind in America. But George Wharton, who I believe was also from a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, um, wrote that at the time of the Erie Canal, rivers were made by the Almighty for the purpose of feeding navigable canals. So the idea that actually the perfection of nature, this idea of almost a second nature, a second creation, is something which kind of we kind of take for granted. We live in this sort of uh, engineered, overcreated world. But really, there is a tension there between nature and civilization, which I think you find even 200 years ago, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and I'm sure readers and listeners can form their own conclusions. But again, if you look at those two quotations, if the Lord had intended internal waterways, he would have placed them there. versus, the Lord created rivers for the feeding of internal waterways, or navigable waterways. You have to ask which of the two holds up better over the last 200 years. Certainly, if you were a Haudenosaunee and you were being pushed off your land, but also, looking at the environmental sustainability of engineering our environment. These great advances, the great wealth and abundance that came through the Erie Canal, the great diversity of American religion that flourished along that corridor came at a cost, and again, that's something that again is being played out even in the present moment when we look at the technologies of the present.
Okay, Matthew, you have the last word. We have been speaking with S.B. Rodriguez Plate, a professor of religious studies at Hamilton College, and Matthew Smith, visiting professor of history and the regional director of public programming at Miami University's Hamilton, Ohio Regional Campus. SB and Matthew, thank you so much for giving your time today to help us understand how the Erie Canal has influenced American religious history there in that area and across the continent and across the globe. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for having us. It's good to chat with you.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a blast. I enjoyed this conversation very much. Thank you.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.